Yes, well, Mária Kovács has the floor. Well, Professor Kovács is teaching, is head of the Nationalist Studies Department at the CEU.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, your guests, your excellencies. The paper I want to give today is intended to raise a few issues on the connection between the anti-Semitism of the 1920s and the anti-Jewish legislation in the 1930s and the 1940s. This connection does get some attention in Hungarian scholarship on the Holocaust, but remarkably enough, we find more discussion of what the connection was not like than what it was actually like. On the one side of the debate, we find those who maintain that we cannot look at the history of the Horthy regime as a history of ever-escalating racism. They argue that interwar Hungarian history did not progress on some predetermined straight line from the 6% university Jewish quota established in 1920 through the anti-Jewish laws of the late 1930s to the deportations. On the other side of the debate, there are those who see more continuity in the history of the Horthy regime and regard interwar Hungarian anti-Semitism as a story of its own, largely a Hungarian story. A story that had unfolded on its own logic up until its fatal encounter during the war with the genocidal project by the German Nazis. In my view, this is a very problematic debate, in the sense that historians are neither able to confirm nor to refute the existence of any straight line that would be confined to Hungarian history and Hungarian history only. But that does not mean that we should give up investigating those connections that did in fact exist between the anti-Semitism of the 1920s and that of the 1940s. I would like to just add one further note on the debate about the straight line in the history of Hungarian anti-Semitism. In the 1920s, racial and ethnic discrimination existed not only in Hungary, but also in several other states of the Western world. For example, the southern states of the United States still retained segregation laws, and these laws were way more severe than anything the university Jewish quota had established as a legislation in Hungary. Blacks were segregated from whites in schools, in many public services, and in most of the army. Unlike in Hungary, in the US, no laws were ever enacted against the Jews. But anti-Semitism did exist in the US too. In several regions, Jews were subject to job discrimination, and some Ivy League and medical schools also introduced Jewish quotas. According to a Roper poll conducted in the 1930s, 53% of all Americans believed that Jews in the US enjoy disproportionate advantages and should be restricted in the economy. During the Great Depression, some observers, for instance the sociologist Daniel Bell, were anxious that any further rise in the racial and ethnic tensions in the US might be so dangerous as to even disrupt the workings of the political system. But bad as they were, ethnic and racial tensions in the US did not escalate to grand-scale violence, either during the so-called tribal 20s or afterwards during the Depression, or the war years. Clearly, in this sense, one cannot speak of any kind of predetermined straight line from ethnic and racial discrimination to subsequent grand-scale state-supported violence. I will return to this problem a bit later in the talk. But for now, let me just reformulate the question about continuity and discontinuity in interwar anti-Semitism in Hungary the following way. Was there ever in the history of the Horthy regime any serious attempt by any of its governments to reconsider the idea of the 1920 Jewish quota, to try to put an end to the discrimination that this legislation had established, or to break away from the mentality of a state-imposed anti-Semitic quota on which this legislation was founded? This is an important question. It is important because 18 years later, in 1938, the 1920 legislation on the Jewish quota served as a prototype legislation for the new anti-Jewish law. This is not at all surprising if we consider that back in 1920, the proponents of the university quota were fully explicit about their plans to extend the Jewish quota way beyond the universities to all income-generating occupations. For them, the university quota was only a first step in a series of future quotas. As the writer Dezső Szabó put it at the time, I quote, "Hungary needs a whole system of legislation in which all paragraphs support all other paragraphs. We need to establish a numerus clausus in all income-generating occupations." Kengerkereső. Two important prime ministers in the 1920s and the 1930s, Gyula Gömbös and Pál Teleki, fully agreed with this view. But the mere fact that the 1920 Jewish quota and the anti-Jewish legislation of the 1930s were based on identical principles does not in itself imply that an extension of the 1920 law beyond the universities into the economy was inevitable. In the United States, for instance, the trend in the rise of racism during the 20s was in fact reversed by the 1930s under Roosevelt's New Deal. Roosevelt very consciously combined the creation of new jobs under the emergency and relief budgets with a considerable effort on the part of the government to reduce job discrimination for blacks and other groups. He established the federal level Fair Employment Practices Committee, and later on, he obliged all firms with government contracts to include a non-discrimination clause. In this way, the New Deal did succeed in bringing about a formidable turn in reversing the 1920s trend of rising racism and opening up the way for new reforms to reduce discrimination. No similar turn ever occurred in the history of the Horthy regime to eliminate discrimination following 1920. But that being said, nor can we maintain that the escalation of anti-Semitism proceeded in a chronologically straight line. In the late 1920s, the government of István Bethlen did, in fact, take one step to mitigate the explicit state-level anti-Semitic discrimination. In 1928, the anti-Jewish wording of the university quota was formally removed from the legislation. But Betlan's 1928 reform did not eliminate the mechanism of discrimination that barred most Jewish applicants from higher education. What the reform did do was to bring a small and largely symbolic improvement both in wording and in the number of admitted Jewish students. This small symbolic improvement was then maintained for 5 years after this, until 1933, and it would probably have continued further, if not for the rise of Hitler to power in Germany. But having said that, the 1928 reform was deeply problematic from the moment of its inception. Prime Minister Betlan left no doubt as to what his major motivation had been to push through the reform, namely, to satisfy external Western critics, particularly in the League of Nations, who found the Jewish quota to be in violation of international law. The emphasis that Betlan put on external pressure as his major concern at once indicated what it was that was so much missing from the reform. What was missing was precisely the power of conviction that the Jewish quota would have been inherently wrong. In other words, what was missing was exactly the kind of commitment that drove Roosevelt to take decisively important steps to reverse the rise of racism and ethnicism within the US. As Roosevelt himself formulated this, I quote Roosevelt, "The democratic way of life within the nation can be defended successfully only with the help and support of all groups within its borders, regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin." Betlan's 1928 reform was not inspired by similar beliefs. His reform was designed to satisfy foreign demands, but without the intention to genuinely eliminate discrimination. In a confidential letter to Betlan, that's already been quoted by our first speaker, Count Klebesberg, Betlan's Minister of Culture, summarized the philosophy of the reform, namely, that it should only be about external appearances rather than genuine internal change. I quote Klebesberg, "Our aim with the reform should be to come up with a new text that will put an end to interference by The Hague or Geneva. But at the same time, we must not allow our nation to be flooded again by thousands of Jewish students." Prime Minister Betlan himself presented the reform in a very similar way. He described it as a concession to foreign demands, but a concession that does not follow from his own views and commitments. In explaining the reform, he told the press that he was not, I quote, "playing a deceptive game." In practice, he said, the hopes that some liberal circles attach to the reform will be disappointed. For now, Hungarian Jews should be satisfied that those aspects of the law that they consider a yellow stain will be eliminated by the government, and they should leave the rest to be sorted out in the future. Betlan's language, in fact, echoed his own personal beliefs, namely that despite the 1928 reform, he still approved of the Jewish quota, as Professor Romsic already mentioned. His views on the Jewish quota were rather similar to those of the radical anti-Semites. He spoke of the Jewish quota as a manifestation of, I quote, "the life instinct by the Christian middle classes in their struggle for survival. Bethlen never really abandoned this view, and the view that Jews in Hungary should be restricted, not even during the reform of 1928. Thus, the 1928 reform of the numerus clausus was not much more than a phony paper reform. On paper, the Jewish quota was eliminated from state-level legislation, but in reality, discrimination continued via lower-level government decrees. During the admission cycle, universities were obliged to cable the Ministry of, not Culture, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, about how many Jewish students they admitted, and the telegrams were immediately forwarded to Geneva, to the office of the Hungarian delegate in the League of Nations. So at the end, the balance sheet of the Bethlen reform was rather gloomy. On the one side, it was a diplomatic success, insofar as from 1928, the League of Nations stopped calling Hungary to account for anti-Semitic discrimination. However, as far as its long-term impact on state anti-Semitism within Hungary is concerned, not much was done. Unlike Roosevelt's attempts to curb the tide of racism in the US, the Bethlen reform did not result in any decisive turn, not the least because the people behind the reform had no genuine intention to bring about such a turn. Therefore, as soon as the League of Nations system was sidestepped by Hitler's coming to power in Germany, the major force behind the Bethlen reform also disappeared. With the external and foreign constraints vanishing, the reintroduction of an explicit Jewish quota and its extension to income-generating occupations was only a matter of time. I would like to conclude with an extremely sad quotation from Prime Minister Bethlen himself. In the summer of 1944, just as Hungary's Jews were being put in the ghettos and on trains, Bethlen, as Professor Romsic mentioned, was already in hiding. From there, he sent Regent Horthy a letter requesting Horthy to dismiss the Stolyai government and put an end to deportations. In the letter, Bethlen gave a brief overview of the process that had led Hungary to become complicit in Nazi policies. The no point of return, or the point of no return, as Bethlen put it, was in 1938. It was the adoption of the so-called first anti-Jewish legislation, the 20% quota. As Bethlen explained, the Darányi government that had planned this legislation expected that this legislation would be the final word in anti-Jewish measures. And they expected that this 1938 legislation would actually put an end to all further demands for more severe legislation and policies. But now, I quote Bethlen, this hope was naturally unfounded. The fact that the legislation had violated the principle of equality before the law was itself an invitation for a legion of further demands to resolve the Jewish question with further legislation. Our nation, Bethlen writes, is running to its own destruction because there is no one to caution the nation and to hold it back from the abyss to which it is racing in a mindless furor. End of quote. So by this time, by the summer of 1944, Bethlen realized and understood that the decisive step in the escalation of anti-Semitism was the violation of the principle of equality before the law. But even then, even in 1944, in his long exposure on history, he failed to confront the fact that the first step in the violation of equality before the law was taken not in 1938, but in 1920 with the university Jewish quota. Once introduced in 1920, no government, including his own, had ever made a genuine and consistent effort to restore the full equality of Jews in order to eliminate what Bethlen himself termed as an invitation for a legion of further demands to resolve the Jewish question. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Mária. Köszönöm szépen. And we go further with the next speaker, who's going to be Mária.